Shibori is a method of manual resist dyeing, achieved by tying or sewing shapes into the fabric before boiling. The word comes from the verb root shiboru, which means to squeeze or press. So basically, we're talking Japanese tie-dye. As a result of the process, my yukata has become textured all over, which I thought was pretty intriguing. Turns out, when you tie the fabric and put it in a vat of hot water for dyeing, the heat sets not only the colour, but the textures as well. Now, traditionally, natural fibres such as cotton are used in these garments, and the sculptural element is subtle. However, if you use a synthetic fibre following the same process, something quite interesting happens on a molecular level. Now, I don't know how much high school science you guys remember, but you've got your solids, your liquids, and your gases, right? Well, as the polyester, a solid, is heated, the molecules within the fibres begin to break down and move towards a liquid state. This allows the fibres to relax or to become malleable and relax into the forms in which they've been tied. Once this occurs, the fabric can be cooled and the molecules return to their original solid state, but retain the shape into which they were tied. The result is three-dimensional fabric that has a memory of its new shape. It can be pulled or stretched as much as you like, but the only way to get it to stay flat is by reheating it to the temperature at which it was set. To avoid spending hours winding cotton around pieces of fabric or using 5 million marbles, I decided to look into using molds so that I could cast my fabric like you would a metal. Most of the machinery and equipment that I looked into using was stuff that I'd never worked with before, such as silicone, which I decided to use to cast my molds in. I decided to use it mostly because it can be heated over and over again, and also because it's malleable, which makes it easy to use. Another thing that I looked into using is the VacForm machine, which allows you to heat a sheet of plastic over a single surface mold to reshape it. My tests worked out pretty well, but the resulting shapes were not interesting enough, I thought. One of the prop students suggested that I pour my silicone directly over my forms, which should allow them to have more shape. I decided to give it a go, but first I needed to work out my shapes. If I was going to pour over my final forms, they were going to have to be really specific. Firstly, they'd have to be detachable from a base so that they wouldn't move around when I was trying to pour my silicone. Secondly, any undercut couldn't be too great, otherwise they'd be hard to remove from the silicone. And thirdly, they couldn't be too complicated or intricate because that wouldn't translate into the fabric. As a result, I decided to 3D print shapes that I could design with the specifications that I needed. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I'm not a big computer person. So I'd like to give a massive thanks to Marcelo for helping me out and being so patient. And also for suggesting that rather than creating a single sheet to mold over, which would limit me to using the same pattern of shapes over and over, for me to make individual molds for each of my shapes, which will allow them to be repositioned and redesigned all the time. It was actually a really good idea, so I ran with that. And I created individual molds for each of my shapes. Ooh, there we go. Oh, no, there we go. So I started off my molds by making 4 walls made of off-brand Lego, a laser cut base with a hole in the middle that corresponded with a hole in my 3D printed forms. This allowed them to be screwed together. I glued my base to my walls, screwed in my 3D printed form, and then poured over the silicone. I was pretty concerned that the silicone wouldn't work since it had been salvaged from the skip, but YOLO, was worth a shot, right? I left it to cure over 24 hours and came back to reveal that it had worked. Hallelujah. So now the next step for me was to get my molds together and place over a piece of fabric. Then with the positive, push the fabric into the negative, thus making it fulfill the whole shape. I put these in a vat of hot water for 20 minutes and then took them out to dry. They too worked, and I was left with pieces like this one. Now, despite working, they weren't perfect the first time round. So with a little bit of tweaking and redesigning of my shapes, which I did using Rhino, which is a software that allows you to create 3D files for 3D printing. Look a bit like this, very scary. Didn't enjoy that process. I was ready to go, and I started mass production, which looks a little bit like this. Turned out like this, which I was pretty impressed with. However, in classic costume fashion, producing this effect wasn't quite enough. I felt as though I needed to prove my worth as a maker by, well, making something.